I'm really, really happy to be here. Gordon really has been my mentor directly and indirectly. When I was a graduate student, I was working with a fellow named Eitan Ochman, and Gordon actually mentored Eitan. So it's like professor mentoring professor. So Eitan was always telling me about what Gordon said. So basically, I knew what to do because Gordon said to Eitan how to become an economist. And then later on, when I became a faculty, I think that Gordon gave me an incredible lessons on how you manage a career. I wasn't that successful, and how you run an organization, which he did an incredible job in the department. So what I like to do is to speak a little bit about the economic of water, and then I'll relate it to the work of Gordon, and then we have this incredible panel that will do most of the work. So generally speaking, if you really look at what happened in the world, you know, we have the population grew from 1 billion people to maybe 11 billion in 2010. And we have water use per capita has been increasing. And there is a perception of water supply crisis. Now we have about 6 times more water than we consume in 2020. Most obvious sources of water are depleted. More people will mean more water. There are a lot of other bad news. The capital cost of water projects are increasing immensely. The environmental costs are high. We have issues of water salinity, groundwater depletion, waterborne diseases that kill a lot of people. Every time that someone builds a water project, people are displaced. Then we have climate change. So to some extent, we really have a perception of water management crisis. And generally, when you go in our college and we listen to the scientists, the big problem is that we need more water supply, and a lot of time people think, okay, first we will desalinate the river, then we will get water from Colombia or whatever, then water from Alaska. But I think that if you look at what Gordon will tell you, is that what you really have, what is really important is well-designed policies and institutions. And actually what I think happened is that policies improved, and the main problem that we have a lot of time is a water management crisis. And we have a big water management crisis is really has been our biggest problem, and improved policies and an incentive can address both water quality and water sustainability. And in order to do it, you need to understand science, you need to develop economic decision making, and you need to have the political will to implement it. So if I really ask myself, what is Gordon's approach to natural resource analysis, I think the first premise that I learned is that Gordon doesn't have a lot of patience to static analysis. Most of us really study static analysis because dynamic analysis is difficult. And dynamic, it's very difficult. That's what you heard the panel before, say dynamic analysis is difficult. The only problem is that we generally live more than a second, most of us. And you really have to think about the long run, and you need to develop dynamic framework with adaptation and learning. And the first contribution that Gordon made was this incredible book that he really taught agricultural economists how dynamic work. Now, it was very, very difficult for most people to figure the mathematics. But the ideas and the concept of adaptation and the concept of learning and experimentation, that's something that you don't need. It's English. And you understand it, and that was a very, very important contribution to our day-to-day vocabulary in economics. And I think that in AgEcon, dynamics played a huge role. The other thing is that people say that no one applied dynamic models. I think that Gordon personally applied dynamic analysis in his day-to-day activity. He is learning and retreating and changing his mind and taking he's a permanent optimizer, and he always thinks in terms of the long run. And I really think that in this regard, and to me, really the important thing in theory, and people know that I am not a big fan of of only looking after data. I'm much more interested in theory because theory has lessons in life. And I really don't know many people that really were applied theorists in the sense that Gordon all the time learn about theory, are criticized of it, internalize it and operate. And to me, that's a big issue of economic, and that's one thing that he did. The other thing that he really emphasized is political economy. Political economy now, Stan Johnson said something really interesting yesterday. They, like everyone else, they were learn about market fundamentalism. You know, I remember when I came to Israel and I went to school, all what I knew about life, that was institution, the economic department tried to take it out, market. The reality is there is a balance between market and institution, and politics is really crucial, and I think that political economy is very, very important, and quantitative analysis can allow to solve disputed figures. The importance of quantitative analysis, it gives you the numbers. And there are many forms of quantitative analysis. Programming, in my view, is kosher. The work that Dick Howard did in California is much, in my view, more important than all the econometrics that we have ever done. You need to balance econometrics and programming, even though the number may not be that great. At the end, our work on AB32, which was very important, was done with a relatively lousy CGE model, but it really did the trick. So we need to combine programming and econometrics and big data and small data, and I think that's one thing to learn. So if you look, Gordon really did a lot of work on natural resources and in water. He did water market, he did great work on the drainage with Usman, a little bit of water quality and regulation, technology and IPR that relate to issues of natural resources. Recently, he did some work on solar energy, climate change. He did incredible work on management of living inventories and endangered species. So I really think that he provides a big foundation for research and work that all of us benefited from it. So if we really look a little bit, what are some of the lessons that we have in improve water project design and on water policy? I think there are about 4 or 5 principles that we learn over the year. I think the first thing is improve benefit cost analysis to incorporate social cost. The fact that in the US we adopted benefit cost analysis, as bad as it is, really resulted in the fact that we have less water project and we move from increasing water availability to improve water management. That we really have to, we need to learn that water projects should include not only cement and concrete, but also management, and that we always have to consider cost for future generations. The other thing that we learn is to optimize water management at all levels. Water transmission, water irrigation, allocation, and design the institution that will make it both efficient and quantitative. And this is a big challenge today. Importance of pricing in water cannot be overemphasized, and also introducing an element of polluter pay and understanding how to understand the water quality problem and externalities. So what we have today, we have a session of several people that work on natural resources, especially in water, that provide a lot of incentive, a lot of coverage of some of the major challenges of the day. When we were in Berkeley, I think, or in California, water economic and policy was one of our main challenges. We have 5 people that really work and have a lot of insight to share, so I'm really happy about this panel. First, we'll have Michael Hahnemann. Michael, a graduate from Harvard, had a wonderful career in Berkeley, and He moved to Arizona State, but not to retire. He continued to operate. He's a member of the National Academy. He really changed the way we think about and measure environmental impact, and he continued to be productive. So I think that it's a tradition in our department, starting with Joe Judge, that you try to continue to write paper till you are 100. So we have two videos. First, Joe Stiglitz, but he basically will say, because one of the things that I think Gordon did, the most important contribution, is he basically build our department. Because when he came here, it was in a transition. There was a lot of work that was done before by Jim Bolt, but we needed someone to put it together, to make it number one. And he did it. And what he did, he decided to be balanced. Ag, resource development. And Joe Stiglitz has something to say about it. And then we have a continued discussion on climate change. So I think it will enjoy these two videos, and then we'll go further.
And he was obviously also very involved in the transformation of what was an agricultural economics school department into a natural resource department. And I thought that was a brilliant idea because we're no longer a farming economy. When the ag schools were founded, some 70% of economic activity was related in one way or other to farming, and now it's 2 to 3%. So if the ag school is going to be relevant, it has to go beyond that, and recognizing that we are a natural resource economy now. I mean, a lot of that, converting that was a really smart decision, and then realizing that among our most important natural resources are our environment, and that moves it into the center, and the ability for Berkeley to be at the center of these important discussions really dates to that kind of transition.
We're headed for something above 3 degrees centigrade over the next 100 years or so, unless we change very quickly. We haven't been at 3 degrees centigrade for about 3 million years as a world. And when we were, sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than now. We're talking about a situation, perhaps in less than 100 years from now, where hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, would have to move. That's happening already. We're already seeing millions on the move as a result of climate change. And climate change means sea level rises, storm surges, desertification, cyclones, the melting of snows and glaciers off the Andes and the Himalayas. The Himalayas, if the snows and glaciers melt off the Himalayas, that transforms the weather and the river flows in particular, shaping the lives of billions of people. This is a story of major disruption in our weather and water systems, as well as, of course, extreme heat in some parts of the world. And it looks as if 50, 60 years from now, if we don't change very quickly, parts of northeastern China and northeastern India would have temperatures of a kind where you couldn't survive outside for very long. So the first thing is to recognize the stakes we're playing for, and second, within that story, to understand how quickly we have to act. The world economy doubles in roughly 2 decades, and in those 2 decades, just for 2 degrees target, we have to cut emissions by 40%. Absolutely. So emissions per unit of output by 80% in 2 decades. And we have to go to net zero by mid-century, because unless we go to net zero, we don't stabilize concentrations. And if we don't stabilize concentrations, we don't stabilize temperatures. So urgency and scale and the stakes we're playing for, everything has to be predicated on understanding that in a clear and strong way. So in other words, we have to build institutions and structures capable of delivering big change very quickly. That means we have to think about what governs innovation an investment because we have to innovate and invest strongly in very different ways from the past. So we have to build solar and wind-based electricity systems. We have to keep the internal combustion engine out of the centre of our cities and get rid of it altogether within 20 years or so. We have to change the gas boilers that heat many of our homes, air source heat pumps, hydrogens. We can see the alternatives, but you can see the scale and nature of what we have to do, and we need incentive structures and institutions which can deliver that. So, for example, on the incentive structures, a price of carbon. In terms of institutions, city governments that can deliver car-free city centres and demand the exclusion of the internal combustion engine from the city centres within 10 or 15 years. So policies and institutions that can deliver those policies are absolutely fundamental. But we also need financial institutions which are capable of financing these new investments, getting the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. So that means institutions which include development banks. They can be multilateral development banks like the EBRD and the World Bank, where I had the good fortune to work, or they can be national development banks, or they can be regional development banks like the EBRD or the European Investment Bank, or indeed the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So those are examples of financial institutions which are crucial to managing the risk and delivering the kind of long-term view that matters. On top of that, you need a selection of strong policies. You need a price for carbon, a price for greenhouse gas emissions. You need the support for research and development, building our institutions around universities and private sector collaborating on research. So, number one, price of carbon. Number two, R&D. Number three, capital market reform and the kind of financial institutions that can deliver in the way I described. You've got to build your networks. So much of this depends on networks. Electricity grids, networks for recycling and reusing our resources, public transport. Those are all networks, and networks require public policy. Not necessarily public ownership, sometimes they do, but they require public policy to function well. You need information. People buying something will want to know what the carbon content of what they buy actually is. They don't want to buy carpets which are created by small children under forced labour, and they don't want to buy goods, at least increasingly they don't, which are created in polluting ways. They need information for that. And finally, of course, we have to recognise that as we work to combat climate change and reduce emissions, we're also having to tackle other forms of pollution. Air pollution is of special importance. It kills many millions a year across the world. It kills 30 or 40,000 in my own country, the UK, 30 or 40,000 a year from air pollution. We kill around 1,700 from car accidents. Right? So we kill something like 20 times more from air pollution. And if we get our climate policies right, we'll also be able to tackle some of those as well.
Okay, Michael, okay. I hope you didn't forget my introduction.
No. No. It's a very great pleasure, personal pleasure, an honor to be able to speak here in this panel. Gordon has always been very supporting, very helpful in my own career, and also a model of how you should function. I'm not necessarily the best student in following Gordon's dynamic approach, but it's always been something I look to, what you need to do to advance your career and get ahead. I also, as has been alluded to, Gordon really led to a renewal of ARE, of Agricultural and Resource Economics. And I think that's hugely important. So in the 1940s, in the old days, ARE was a premier department worldwide. It was the place where you learned the latest techniques in simultaneous equation econometrics. Irma Edelman used to say when she was an undergraduate at Berkeley in the late 40s, she had to go to George Kuznets's lecture on econometrics to learn about the work being done in the Cowles Foundation. The economics department didn't teach it. And I've always thought the strength of agricultural economics in those days, before and after World War II, was that we had data on supply and demand of eggs and milk and tomatoes and other agricultural crops. So we had data, but the other thing is we had an informed audience. If an agricultural economist produced an analysis of the egg market or the beef market or whatever that didn't make sense to the actors in those markets, to the growers or the processors or whatever, he or she would hear. There was an informed audience. The audience wasn't economists reading academic journals. The audience was people in the real world for whom this was their livelihood. And that kept us honest in a way that I think wasn't true and isn't true with most areas in microeconomics. The practitioners in transportation or urban economics or social policy or education or housing don't bother to read articles on those topics in the academic economics journals. But as part of the cooperative extension process, our results, our findings were translated to the people in the real world, and if they thought we were missing the point, they would speak up. And as I say, I think it kept us honest. Well, agriculture, as Joe Stiglitz said, agriculture's role declined in the economy, and the amount of work we did on that topic declined. So I was hired 43 years ago with Peter Burke to introduce environmental and resource economics. And many other people, Tony Fisher, many others came along, so it's a strong program. I'd like to feel that our approach, a hallmark of our approach, was empirical work that was realistic, that was rooted in the real world, rather than just being theoretical. That is, we need to be kept honest and we need to be kept grounded. And Gordon played a huge role in bringing about this transformation. Peter and I were the beachhead, if you like, but a whole bunch of other faculty came along, and we established ARE as the premier department in the world in that field. But with this emphasis on realistic, reality-grounded empirical work, not just pure theory. A couple more things. So, as you know, most economists try and avoid distributional issues and try and theorize around them by ignoring the distributional, by looking at the potential Pareto criterion. Do the aggregate gains, how do they compare with the aggregate losses, regardless of whom they accrue to? And in environmental economics, that's an idiotic approach. Externalities is about a conflict of interest. Somebody gains a private benefit but inflicts an external cost on somebody else. And trying to think of environmental policy, ignoring the distributional consequences, is like trying to study the reproduction of animals without getting into sex. It undermines the usefulness of the research. This is true of water above all. The salient feature of surface water is return flows. I've just completed a history, or a comparative history, of the property right to water in the US West and in Australia. the crucial difference is return flows. The US, under common law, where water is property, return flows are the single most complicated problem in dealing with diversions, with property rights, with water transfers. Australia, it turns out, first of all, nationalized water. So water is not private property, it's a bureaucratic license, and it has been for over 100 years. But also Australia set up water rights as the gross diversion. And so return flows have been entirely sidelined in Australia. And that's played a major role in their success in marketing reforms, water marketing reforms, over the last 25 years. But where you have to deal with return flows, this is very much a matter of political economy. And an important feature of Gordon's work has been to approach environmental, resource, and other microeconomic issues in economics, looking at the political economy. Rather than assuming it away as kind of untidy and a nuisance, it really is of the essence in many of these environmental problems that we face today. And what that means is, it's not just one needs good policies, one needs good politics. One needs policies that deal with the political economy, that provide compensation. In other words, it's not just a matter of incentives. It's a matter of dealing with the losers and getting them to go along. So it's very much politics as well as political economy as well as policy. And the history of Australia and what it accomplished in the last 25 years involves getting the politics right, getting the compensation. So Australia has spent $13 billion in Australian dollars in paying off, buying water and subsidizing investment in irrigation efficiency for farmers. So it's a reflection of Gordon's emphasis on political economy. Very quickly, climate change, which Nick Stern talked about. Let me just say a few things. Bill Nordhaus deserves his Nobel Prize for work he did up to 2005. DICE has lost touch with reality entirely since 2005. So climate change is it's a global spatial scale, a huge time scale. It's a murderous challenge. My own work of my former student Wolfram Schlenker and others, I think shows the major effect for the next 4 or 5 decades will be local extreme events, local droughts, local rain events, local flooding, not occupying whole continents, but the Midwest or California or the Southwest or whatever. And on a time scale of maybe weeks or months, not years, not decades. It's the type of disruptions we're experiencing right now, last week and maybe this weekend with the extreme fires. Those are hard to model, but they're being completely ignored in the existing climate impact levels. The work that Wolfram did showed that if you look at the next 4 decades, 90% of the impacts were associated with extreme temperatures. Later on, only 60% of the impacts were associated. That is, everyday average temperature was then, at the end of the century, sufficiently hot that it messed things up. But for the next few decades, it is local extreme events. And I'm delighted to say that many of my colleagues here and our students are focusing on those, and that I think is the right focus. This is really a reflection of the course on which Gordon set ARE. I think it's been an extremely productive course, and I think all of us, faculty and students, are really grateful to Gordon for for his vision and his guidance in pointing us in that direction. Thank you, Gordon.
Okay, so next is Ariel Dinar. Ariel is a distinguished professor for School of Public Policy at UC Riverside. He got his degree from the Hebrew University in Israel. He was for several years in Riverside, and then he was the economist of the drainage program, where actually Gordon contributed, and it was a very important and Michael program in California that tried to manage the drainage problem, but also really provided the canon of literature on water economics that was useful later on. Then Ariel was the chief water economist on the World Bank and developed a wonderful global program, and now he's in Riverside. Please, Ariel.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the opportunity to wake up this morning very early and coming to Berkeley just to realize that the temperature in Berkeley is not that different than in Riverside. Always I thought that it will be cold in Berkeley. I would like to continue the line of presentation that was taken by Harry and by Joe to talk about how work and help from Gordon shaped more or less also my work and my success. And I thought that this is a very unique situation where you can show on a timeline over almost 35 years how I, in different milestones, how I benefited from the work by Gordon. I will focus mainly on the work that Gordon did on the political science negotiations over common property resources and negative externalities with focus on water. So what I found, and this will be a kind of an umbrella observation, is that the work that at least impacted me had different or several characteristics. First of all, it had a very strong background or basis of engineering and scientific facts that went into the political economy models. And I will show you in the couple of slides that I have also what I mean about that, with that. And this is in contrast to other publications that have been in the literature on public policy and externalities. Another thing that I found very relevant for my needs and my interest was that almost every work that Gordon published in that specific area had a policy relevance. So it had a strong theoretical background, it was supported by empirical and scientific evidence, and had also a derivative of lessons for policy. In some, as you will see also from the 5 slides that I have, some of his publications, I would even dare to say that they were ahead of their times. And if we look at what Gordon did in the, I knew Gordon starting in the 90s, early 90s, actually 1990, not before. I heard just that he had also, in the 70s, he was already a Lion, but I knew him only from 1990. And even at that time, we can see immediately what was done. So in 1990, as David introduced me, I was part of the San Joaquin Valley Drainage Program. And this was, in California, a big issue in the 1986 and onward, where they realized that there is a big problem of negative externality in the form of salinity, drainage, selenium, and all of that. And at the end of that program, David Zilberman, who was at that time my mentor, suggested that we collect all the relevant work on drainage and salinity in the San Joaquin Valley and publish a book. And I was new to that. I didn't even know the people. I didn't know Gordon, nobody in California to the extent that I could approach. And I was really happy to see that all these papers that were contributed to that volume of almost about 1,000 pages was so much on the point that it was really a contribution. One of the paper, or one of the chapters at that time was a chapter that was co-authored by Gordon and by late Siko Zussman on the political economy of the drainage in the San Joaquin Valley. And this is the basis for what I am saying, what I said about the use of physical and scientific evidence in his models, and this is in particular about the behavior or the movements of drainage, about the structure of the institutions leading to the effects of one water district on other water districts in the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. So this was one paper, one chapter in that book at that time, that later I had a very nice surprise to see that it appeared with some improvements and updates in a different publication. The second characteristic, I would say, of Gordon is that he was always ready to help. And later, when I was in the World Bank, and in the year 2000, we had, or 1999, we had a big project on water pricing in irrigation and the urban sector. And we wanted to culminate the project with a big workshop, bringing people who worked on different aspects of water pricing reforms. I picked the phone and asked Gordon if he can come and talk about something related to the political economy of pricing reforms. And of course, Gordon had a secret shelf. He pulled work that was ongoing or almost done and contributed a paper on collective choice in water systems or water pricing decisions. And this was again another one of the important chapters of that book. And then several years later, when I was already back in California at UC Riverside, and I became the editor of a new journal that before establishing it, I had many talks with many people, including Gordon, giving me the support to go for it, and not only that, but also promising to help as much as needed, and then submitting again another paper for the inaugural issue of the journal with, again, two, at that time, I don't know if they were still graduate students or one of them maybe was already a research associate with him, Leo Simon and Susan, who is here on that panel, and contributing a chapter on externalities, negotiations, and political economy of problems that at that time probably were not that problematic as they are today. And this is again another reason for me to say it was ahead of its time, because as we talk, Salton Sea and their problems are in the center of a big discourse in California about the future of moving water from the dwindling Colorado to the Salton Sea region. Again, in that paper, as you can see on the right-hand side, everything that was done on the political economy and the negotiation procedures was supported by empirical facts and science about the movements of the negative externalities between upstream, downstream, and so forth. And then finally, actually this is one before the last, I don't have a slide for the last item, but yes, finally, I started teaching a class at UC Riverside, and I looked at the literature and couldn't find a good textbook, one textbook. You know, I found many papers, but I thought that a textbook would be better. And I just picked the phone and called Gordon, and I asked him, Gordon, do you have an idea where can I find a good textbook? And he said, you know, if you will be patient, in about less than a year, there is going to be a textbook. I said, but I'm not patient. I need it for next quarter. Okay, no problem. I will send you the final PDF of the book, and you can use it. So this is Gordon, more or less, you know, in less than 10 minutes, and this is how he affected my work and my the direction that I was developed. I just want to, in 20 seconds, as Harry said, to say that this morning I heard about Gordon's work on subsidies and trade, and if I will have another opportunity later in the session to talk about that, I will add about how did I learn, how did I apply the issue of subsidy, what is the concept that you used? This detachment of the subsidy from the actual use, decoupling of subsidy to work that I did in Mexico on the problem of subsidizing energy for pumping groundwater and creating huge externalities. So I will talk about it later if the chair will allow me. Thank you.
Don't forget, by the way, being generous works back in your direction. I sent you the book, but then when I submitted the book for publication to Cambridge University Press, who was one of the reviewers? You.
This is, you know, I came from South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and in that guest home that I stayed, they had every morning, they had a statement that was, they were taking it from somewhere. And one of them was, you rise by lifting others.
Done. Okay, next is Yaakov Tzur. Yaakov is a professor at the Hebrew University, and he got his PhD in our department. Gordon really is responsible for having Yaakov in our department. Yaakov was a student of a brilliant guy named Pinchas Zussman. And Zussman wrote a letter of commendation, and he wrote that Yaakov is a good student. Now, Zussman was very, for him, good was good. And Gordon looked at it, and he said, Yaakov is brilliant, you must have him in the program. And he was better, his file was good in American English, means below mediocre. So, but this intervention of Gordon really gave us one of the best water scientists today. Yaakov.
So now it explains some puzzles that I will go through. You know, Harry, I was in the same Giannini vintage with Harry. And so when Harry said that he met Gordon 42 years ago, it reminded me that I met Gordon 41 years ago. And this was 1978. I think Gordon was still in Harvard at that time, and he came to visit his colleague and friend, Yair Mudlak, which is no longer with us, at the Department of Agricultural Economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which is in Rehovot, located. At that time, I was a master's student, and Yair convinced Gordon to give us a series of lectures, which kind of wrapped it in kind of a mini course that we get some credit. When we were a bunch of master students, and Gordon gave us a lecture and the series, and none of us could follow much of what's going on. Our English skills were very limited, so we didn't really pick much of the language, let alone the content. But I think that probably my English was a bit better than the others, so this was the impression that you got. So now it explains the eventual that ended up in Berkeley. But I remember that the lectures made an enormous impression on all of us. And it definitely affected my decisions to try to pursue a PhD in the field and to try to do it in Berkeley, because Yair told us that you're going to Berkeley to assume that the chair of the department. And eventually I tried, and both trials eventually succeeded. So and now from what David said, I now understand how at least the try to go to Berkeley actually worked out. And so in the fall of 79, I came to Giannini, I came to Berkeley, and started the PhD program. 4 years later, I went back to Israel, and the department was totally a completely different place. When I came, it was right after Gordon assumed the chair of the department. And even though we were, as graduate students, we were busy, concerned more about the next homework assignment or the next final, we could see, feel, and hear the changes as they occur. And when I left the department, when I graduated 4 years later, it was a completely different place. And now I also understand why I was accepted in the program. So what I want to do, I want to comment a little bit about Gordon's contribution to water economics, which is one of my fields. And I would like to do it in the context of what I call a water economy. So a water economy, well, first of all, we have sources and we have users, sectors. And the primary source is, of course, natural water. So natural water comes in the form of flows and stocks. And we have 4 main user sectors: domestic, industry, agriculture, environment, and we can have some more. And then we realize that we have to collect the sewage that comes from domestic and industry and treat it for health and environmental considerations, no matter what we do with it. And if we have a scarcity problem, we may as well reuse it. And then we have a second source of water, which is recycling. And then if we need more water, at least we are a nearby sea, we can actually desalinate. So this is the 3 main sources and 3 main sectors of a water economy. And then we have the physical infrastructure that enables to convey and supply water from each source to each sector. And we have the institutional infrastructure of water rights, property rights, allocation rules, and so on. So, and in making a decision about water policy, we look at the benefits of allocating water to each sector, and these comes from the demand, the willingness to pay or the demand of the different sectors, including the environmental sector, which is an externality. I will not go into this here. Now in this construct, I'd like to discuss some of Gordon's contributions, and the first one is in the desalination. Actually, one of the earliest work on desalination were made by Gordon and co-authors, and they actually applied learning by doing, dynamic optimization models involving learning by doing. Learning by doing was a concept that was introduced by Arrow back in the early 60s. And this was one of the earliest application of that in the context of desalination. Now, when I looked at Gordon's papers, I realized that this is exactly what is happening in Israel. Israel is a big desalinator. Now, more than 60% of domestic water consumption comes from desalination plants. This is a fairly recent phenomenon. The first large-scale desalination plant was opened at 2005. So looking at 14 years, that's it. And since then, we built 5 large desalination plants that provide the water, desalinated water, to more than 60% of domestic consumption. Now, if you look at the evolution of the desalination plants, you see the learning by doing, because there is no, actually, you see that the 2005 one, the cost of the desalinated water at the plant's gate, the cost is about 70 to 80 cents per cubic meter. If you look at the most recent one, it is closer to 50 cents per cubic meter, and it is all learning by doing, because the technology is the same. Reverse osmosis, it's only because we learn to do it better, more efficiently. And this is something that we need to take into account when we look at there was a lot of debate, by the way, in the Israel economic and agricultural community about when to start desalination. And the issue of learning by doing is instrumental. And Gordon actually worked that out in, I don't think in 72 there were any desalination in California or anywhere else in the US. Certainly not in Israel. And now in the last experience that we have, in the recent experience that we have, I think that these insights are really proven as very effective. So this is the first comment that I want to make. Then, so this also relates to what Larry was discussing in the previous session about Gordon's contribution to, and David said it, Gordon's contribution to dynamic modeling, dynamic programming. We have to realize that dynamic optimal control was invented during the 40s, would become accessible in the West. It was invented by a Russian mathematician. Only in the 50s, dynamic programming was invented in the 50s. It infiltrated economics in the 60s. And here we have an application of these methods in a very real world and relevant situation that now, almost 40 years later, more than 40 years, well, we're talking almost 50 years, has proven to be very relevant, very relevant. Then there is a paper by Gordon in the Water Resources Research, 76, also dynamic analysis, dynamic optimization of physical infrastructure investment. Infrastructure is about half of the cost. So if you look at the cost of water allocation, about half is the capital, the capital infrastructure, and then the other is the different variable energy and variable cost. And the investment decision are crucial. And here we have already in 76, this work of Gordon, these contributions. And then finally, Gordon have a bunch of contributions with co-authors, Rachel and Susan and Leo and others, on institutions. And water institutions, if you want to understand, Michael was talking about water institution in the context of California versus Australia. If you look at, say, if you want to understand why Israel is such a success story in the Israel water economy, compare, say, to California or India or other places, you only have to look at institutions. that's it. Institution explains everything. Israel, by being a young country, was able to, not tied by historical commitments, was able to develop institutions, nationalize water. Every drop of water, natural water in Israel is nationalized, is centralized, and it has become a huge success story. Of course, we have our own problems, but compared to others, particularly at least those that I know in other places, and everything is institutions. Institutions are crucial. So those are just 3 examples of Gordon's contribution in this area that I actively do research on, and I really appreciate. And thank you very much, Gordon. I hope you'll continue. If I would write a recommendation letter, if this would be a recommendation letter, I would conclude in the following sentence. I wholeheartedly recommend that you promote Gordon to the rank of emeritus professor so that he can continue to explore uncharted territory and excel in everything he does. So.
Okay. Next is Susan Stratton-Sayers. Susan is a more recent graduate of our department. She is an associate professor at Smith College, and she worked on a variety of water topics using political economy, simulations, and her work is both combined theory and a lot of practical and empirical insights. Please, Susan.
Thank you. I wanted to start by thanking Gordon for inviting me to participate in this event. It's such an honor to be able to participate on such a distinguished panel and to have an opportunity to reflect on Gordon's many contributions to understanding water policy and environmental policy more generally. It's been really interesting serving on one of the later panels in this event. I've been struck by how many of the things that I was planning to highlight are things that we've been hearing over and over again. And so there's 2 that are themes we've already heard that I want to highlight again. So the first is to touch on Gordon's widely varied interests and expertise. As a PhD student, I was always struck. I would walk into Gordon's office with some new topic I wanted to talk about, and it didn't matter what it was. Gordon always had insightful questions, as some have mentioned, also very direct questions. But they were always questions that really helped me sharpen my ideas and really craft them into coherent analysis. But for Gordon's, in addition to its effect on me, I think for Gordon's research, one of the really special things about these varied interests is that it allowed a lot of cross-fertilization across sort of his different fields and different careers. And as I was looking through the papers of Gordon's that relate to this session, and particularly trying to connect a little bit with ecosystem services, which was something David suggested I look at, I found his 2000 JPE article with Arthur Small on the economic value of biodiversity. In this paper, they develop an improved model of bioprospecting that incorporates a much more realistic assessment of how companies would actually go about testing the economic value of different species. And it wasn't a paper I'd been aware of before, but I was really struck reading it by how it's drawing on all of Gordon's different careers. His expertise as dean of the College of Natural Resources, thinking about intellectual property and innovation, and his experience in the private sector as an entrepreneur. And I think that really emphasizes the way each of these careers were really enhancing all of the others. The second theme that I'm going to talk about at more length is one that's been brought up several times already on this panel, which is the critical role of political economy and institutions in understanding water policy. And this is the topic of most of my own work with Gordon. And so just as in the case of market transition that we heard about yesterday, water governance has been in transition for most of Gordon's career and remains so today. We've seen a strong increase in water markets and interest in water pricing. And while we've seen that strong increase, we've seen a substantial but perhaps somewhat smaller increase in their actual use. And so as a result, today we see that still many, if not most, water resources are allocated politically. And that means understanding water policy means understanding political economy and institutions. And particularly, we see that water pricing can often help alleviate the conflict between different consumptive uses of water resources, but it's much less effective at addressing the question of competing in-stream and environmental flows versus those consumptive uses. And those are determined politically through negotiation. I actually was noticing the book that Ariel mentioned. The PDF of those chapters was a major portion of the agricultural policy course that I took with Gordon. And I particularly remember the chapter on talking about the rules by which rules are made, the structures in which we think about policy choice. And much of Gordon's work on water governance builds on that, a lot of it using the Rausser-Simon bargaining model, and emphasizes the way the structure of the negotiation, the specifics of who's at the table, how agreements are made, what issues are on the table, that those end up determining the outcomes of the negotiation as much or more than the underlying economics of the policy problems. And actually, one thing I wanted to highlight connects with a point that Dave Sunding made yesterday about the role of laws in influencing environmental policy. One of the things that we noticed in a lot of Gordon's work and in a lot of my own work with Gordon is the role of laws like something like the Endangered Species Act in granting environmental groups a seat at the table in the negotiation, or in constraining the set of options that can emerge from negotiations. And I just like that as an example of how we can highlight that those rules are really what's influencing outcomes. I also wanted to include a quick story, which is that at my PhD hooding ceremony, when Gordon was speaking about my dissertation, which focused on negotiation over groundwater use with examples from Spain and California, as Gordon was talking about it, he talked about the importance of understanding groundwater and looking at this through negotiation. And then he also mentioned the importance for China and India. And some of my family members who were there asked me after, they're like, so why was he talking about China and India? Your work was on Spain and California. And so I mentioned Gordon's penchant for seeing the big picture and trying to draw connections between things. But I didn't realize at the time, since I had at the time no intention of working in those areas, that as he usually is, Gordon had great foresight. My most recent paper on groundwater is indeed about groundwater in India. And while the work isn't explicitly a political economy story, there is a political economy story embedded in it. And it connects to the idea of, that we heard about this morning, about policies that are originally PERTs, eventually can transition into pests. And so what we've seen in parts of northern India and other areas of South Asia, we've seen large investments, groundwater subsidies, in promoting groundwater irrigation. And this was done for really good reasons. And they've been enormously successful. In India, groundwater irrigation has increased over 500% in the last 50 years. But that's come with a cost that is becoming increasingly apparent of the falling groundwater levels. Today, in many parts of India, electricity is so heavily subsidized to the point that if the subsidies were removed, farmers would immediately stop using groundwater because if they were paying the full cost of the electricity, it wouldn't be worth pumping the water to the surface. But despite the concerns about groundwater, despite the recognition of that, those policies remain in place. And that's all political economy. Rather than restricting pumping, the government continues to subsidize those. And so at its core, that's emphasizing that this is a political economic problem. We need to identify ways of compensating these farmers to change behavior in a way that can actually move us forward. And we were talking recently about the big data in the last session. There's been an amazing increase in the ability to understand what's going on, but the data by itself can't solve this core political economic problem that's been such a feature in Gordon's career.
After Susan's story, I think that several mentioned Gordon's paper in our book with Zussman. And I think it was an incredibly important paper. And the main lesson of the paper is that things have to be real bad before they become better. Because when you have a lot of parties, the parties that have the power don't really care about the system. They care about what happened to them. And unless things are bad in terms of drainage or other things, there will be no reform. And I think that I remember that at the end we needed I needed to give a presentation once to a bunch of people. Why don't we solve problem in California? And I remember that I used exactly this paper that really used a very sophisticated approach to thought if you have several parties, the parties that have the power a lot of time, unless you have some bargaining and transfer, they won't give up. And that's exactly what happened, unfortunately, many times in the state. Now it's a real pleasure to have Rachel Goodhue. Rachel came to Berkeley, and she was a young student and started working with Gordon, and she had a wonderful career working on a lot of topics and really doing, covering wide varieties of topics in agricultural economics, strawberries and production and natural resources, in almost every topic, and it's combined theory and applied and political economy. And in addition, she has been very active. She was a leader in the academic senate, both in Davis and statewide, and now she is the director of the Department of Agricultural, chairman of the Department of Agricultural Economics. So really happy to have Rachel here.
So thank you, David. And in Gordon's honor, and it's something I've learned, I have to admit, from both David and Gordon, is there are rules, and then there are rules that ground the rules, and I'm certain that under Gordon's rules, he'll let me stand at the podium instead of sit in my chair. And so as David mentioned, I'm department chair, and one of the things I thank Gordon for. So I guess I'll start it by saying that, you know, when I was a student, one of the great things about Gordon, among others, that if you had the nerve to ask him a question, he'd answer it, okay? But that made you kind of careful about what questions you asked. On the other hand, I learned a lot about UC and a lot about academic leadership from him. So that's one reason I'm department chair. And that's another reason I'm going to thank him for inviting me here today. You guys have heard a lot of my colleagues. You heard Julian, you heard Colin, you heard Dan. And so as department chair, what I got to start is a list of the things I need to check on when I get back to Davis. And it's starting with, what does Alston have in the other 3 drawers in his file cabinet? So thank you, Gordon. And then the other thing I've been thinking about, Susan said that a lot of the themes that she was going to bring up, we've been hearing about, and we hear them in common. And then the other thing we've been hearing are stories about Gordon. All right, and so I got a big stock of stories about Gordon because I went to grad school here, okay, and I have a special one for his family later. I went to grad school here in Berkeley, and then I went to Davis, which is where Gordon went to grad school and started his career. And so all sorts of people had all sorts of stories they were willing to tell me. Alex McCallum may share some of his with you if you ask him nicely. And so then I started thinking about my own stories with Gordon. What stories can I tell? What stories can I tell? And I'm like, no, not that one. And then it's like, all right, let's start by no story that involves anyone in the room. It's like, okay, set those aside. And then last night, Jill McCluskey, I'm like, Jill, what about this story? And Jill's like, no. And I'm all right, throw that one out. So what I finally ended up with is a story Gordon told me. Okay, so he's going to have to help me with a detail or two. So Gordon always says he's from a dairy farm, but somehow he got experience with processing tomatoes. Okay, and as we've heard, Gordon's always thinking, right? And he's looking at the system and he's optimizing his outcome. And so he was growing processing tomatoes before they were mechanically harvested. So you had crates of processing tomatoes, and then they had to be graded. And what Gordon had figured out is he says, well, look, every load, the grader went 4th row down, 3rd crate down. That's when he graded, and those were the best tomatoes in every load. I don't know if I got the row and level right, Gordon. Right. Okay. Made an impression. And so, you know, Gordon, he's thinking and he looks at the entire system. Okay. What did he need to optimize those returns? And then the other thing that story does for us, besides, again, illustrate a critical part of Gordon and why he is who he is that it also illustrates that when he thinks about natural resources, he did start with a base in agriculture. Okay, and I went back way back, but you could say that intellectually that's also the truth for agricultural economics. How do we go from being departments of agricultural economics to agricultural and natural resource economics? Agriculture is founded in natural resources. Like Michael said, it's the actual industry members who kept us honest, and you can also say it's the actual physical and biological systems. Those keep us honest too. So what else? And this is with David's blessing, so I'll share the blame. This session's focused on water primarily, and so what I want to do is broaden it back out a little, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about natural resource questions in the context of agricultural pest management. Okay, this is not pests as in perts and pests, okay? These are things that, that damage or kill economically important crops. And so then I'm going to frame it at the most basic level in terms of Gordon's work with Harvey Le Pen about, in the 70s, about the joint production of goods and bads, when you have a final consumption good, and then you have what he calls pollution. In this context, you can think of that as the negative effect of pests on agricultural output, okay? And then pest management, what is that? That's simply their mitigation techniques. How much are you going to put into pest management? How much is it going to cost? What does that mean for your final output and consumption? And so I'm going to pair that with, in honor of Gordon's integrated approach to policy analysis. I'm going to talk about not just pest management, but I'm going to focus a lot more on the policies, because you can see the linkages with other natural resource applications, and the political economy and institutional design, okay, and how those things all play together in terms of pest management. First, dynamics. That's been coming up at a lot of the sessions. Do you need to use them? Is static analysis enough? Pest management, it's dynamic, period, okay? So that's true of a lot of things. You know, based on a biological system, Gordon's early work is undoubtedly informed about understanding that key element of time, okay? People exist over time. Most everything we analyze is going to exist over time or be part of a longer process, even if it seems instantaneous. One topic in that area where it's important is resistance management. So because of natural mutations, a pesticide that was originally effective is going to kill fewer and fewer pests over time, right? In other words, fewer of them are susceptible. And so susceptible pests can be controlled, resistant ones can't. What is susceptibility? It's a non-renewable natural resource. Okay, what do we know about non-renewable natural resources? There's a need to try and optimize the rate of extraction. Okay, here the rate of loss, you could say. And there could be a divergence between the private and public interests. Okay, so that's very classical. And so that's classical. What's a policy prescription? You can restrict use, okay, put rules on use. You could allocate the right to use, okay? The problem with that is what criteria, right? How are you going to set that policy? And that is fundamentally political economy. I'll come back to a couple of concrete examples that speak to that, but who has the right and how are you going to allocate it? And so this, again, is the kind of question that drives a lot of what Gordon did, is he didn't stop with what policy. How are you going to get that policy? Is it achievable? What's the best you can do given the realities of the situation? So the next thing that I want to link is pest management is spatial. Okay, pest spread, disease spreads over time and space. And so I brought this in part just based on the title of the last session, okay, because really what kind of a policy are we talking about? Well, what's the optimal scale of monitoring, okay? What's the optimal scale of managing a natural resource? And then finally, and this is a question that Gordon's work has spoken to, even without all these fancy data that are now available, is does the scale of property rights, is that going to hinder or aid in terms of implementing that optimal scale? And there's Camille. Okay, so one example related to this is Gordon's work in Mexico with Camille Antonari on community forest management. And then, of course, there was already mentioned Gordon's work on groundwater extraction with Susan and Leo Simon. And so again, those are questions where scale is critical. Then what else? What else matters? So You know, pest management, so we're talking agricultural production. Pest management is an essential input, so soil, so's water. Although maybe not so. We had a nice lunchtime conversation with Keith and Jeff and others about, you know, non-soil agriculture. But nonetheless, we have multiple natural resources in general. And so when you make policy choices, you run into the theory of second best, which Larry addressed this morning. And I want to highlight a related but different implication. So that, you know, we have this idea of policy incidents, how they interact with, and that leads to the theory of the second best. But then I would say we need to move beyond that to the political economy. Because if you think about it, and pesticides are a nice example for this, is a lot of the regulation, you could say, is associated with the idea that pesticides are bad. Okay, they generate negative externalities. And then on the other hand, what about soils? Soil conservation is good. Okay, how do we manage that natural resource? We incentivize policies. So we have this, something's a bad, we're going to regulate it. Something's a good, we're going to have a voluntary incentivization policy. So, you know, that's the kind of political economy questions that move that one level above what's happening with the policies themselves. Okay, that's, you know, part of the way that Gordon thinks about things is taking it one step up, one step beyond. So then the fourth is, you can call it heterogeneity or you can call it lobbying. Either one of them is, the moral is they matter. Okay, each one matters. And so people lobby to collect rents, to get special treatment, to get priority, and, you know, to influence the design of regulations. And and in some cases, you can see a process then that is designed to facilitate that kind of lobbying. And David, I'm almost hoping in the question session will disagree with me. But I would say that the critical use exemption process when methyl bromide was being phased out was designed in a way to maximize the impact of lobbying. Okay? Because producers were supposed to define themselves into the smallest similar group and then make a case for why they should be able to continue to use methyl bromide. Okay, so it was basically like, we invite you to lobby and bid for this rent. So you also see other interesting things in terms of setting the rules, okay, setting the policy. Another case in pesticide regulation is there's a fumigant called 1,3-dichloropropene, and it's subject to township caps in the state of California. Annually, only so much of it can be applied. Now, if you're an economist, you're saying, oh, great, you must have an auction, it goes to the highest valued use, right? Well, no, it's first come, first served. So annually, it's just the quota is allocated by who's willing to come and buy it, all right? And what's interesting is people don't pre-buy. Susan, I know you know what I meant. So it's first come, first served, and that seems really odd to us, right? And then we don't see the behavior of people trying to pre-buy their share of the allocation. Okay, so that's very interesting. But then the next step is, so it's being allocated by whom? Company that sells it, okay? And so what does that mean? If you get to allocate your product yourself, what might you hope you can do? You can allocate it on a willingness to pay basis, okay? So why might we see that? Well, you know, maybe the government made a mistake, okay? But I'm going to argue that this might be a case where it's about the rules making the rules, okay? And I'm going to argue that it's a case of Gordon's rules, about the rules making the rules, is that the state didn't want to get into adjudicating who got this, right? They wanted to set the quantity, and they didn't want to set the use. And so they chose this approach where the actual producer could be, have some scope for setting prices simply because they thought that that was politically preferable, even if politically preferable to trying to come to something that was socially efficient, okay? So then, finally, as others have said, institutional design is fundamental, okay, and it's a theme in Gordon's work. So when we think about institutions, pest management and pesticides are odd, okay? You see some things like inspections at the borders and that generally are run by the State Department of Agriculture, Food and Agriculture here in California. So that might be a logical place to put pesticide regulation, right? Agricultural production, pesticides are an input related to efforts like excluding invasive species. Alternatively, negative externalities associated with pesticides, perhaps it should be in an environmental agency, okay? Now, why does this matter? So we were hearing just in this session, which was convenient for me, about who gets a seat at the table, right? Now, what I'm going to argue is that this question of where should regulation of pesticides be located is who gets to hold the gavel, okay? Because that's a person who can control the narrative. We heard about that in a different context yesterday. No, Bill, I don't want to hear from you. Control the narrative. And so then what does that mean for us? Why is this interesting? Because you see instances of the gavel changing hands, right? That happened in the state of California in the late 1980s. The regulation of pesticides moved from the California Department of Food and Agriculture to the newly created Department of Pesticide Regulation in the Environmental Protection Agency of California. So why did that happen? If you were in California around then, and many folks were, from what I've heard over the past 2 days, then you can think about the social forces that were changing. So this institutional transformation, it's exactly the kind of phenomenon that Gordon has asked regarding institutions in many other contexts. And the tools that he's developed and the insights he's made can contribute to addressing these kinds of institutional changes elsewhere, as in pest management and pesticide use regulation. And so David mentioned that I've worked in a lot of areas, and what I learned from Gordon has informed all of that. So thank you for that too. And the final word, and this is for our Master of Ceremonies, and no, he wasn't holding up a time card. So, Vice Chancellor, yesterday you said that you'd learned that economists can model anything people do, and all us economists, we agree. And Vice Chancellor, you know, what I hope you've learned from this session is that we can model anything pests do, too. And finally, you know, Gordon would never limit what economists can do to people or pests, but he's still working on politicians.
Okay. Thanks a lot. We have about 5 minutes, so I'd like to open the floor to 1 or 2 questions, if there are any, or comments. Yes.
I would like to mention Gordon's 1974 paper in the American Economic Review, where he introduces endogenous technological change in the natural resource industry. And my impression is that this is the first paper that does this type of modeling. So technology does not fall from the sky, but instead is a reaction to scarcity. And I feel that this paper is unfortunately very underappreciated. But this literature has evolved a lot over the last couple of years with endogenous technological change. I just wanted to mention this paper again because I wish it was cited more in that more recent literature. And he was really the first to think about this in this kind of very rigorous way.
Any other questions? I think given the limit of time, I'd like to thank the panel, and we'll go to the next session.